behaviorism is basically that materialistic worldview applied to psychology, which I don't even think you should be allowed to call yourself a psychologist if you don't believe in a psyche. If if you believe you don't have a soul or a psyche, but you only have a soma, that's the Greek word for flesh or physical body, but they're denying the psyche, well, then you should be a physician studying the flesh, not a psychologist studying the mind. But that's my little bias as a philosopher. But many, of course, as I'm sure you've met in your field and discipline, and especially reading and studying, many of the experts in schools of thought are deeply seated in this behavioristic worldview, which is materialism. Only the physical material exists. We do not have minds, souls, or spirits. With the demise of the body and the brain is the demise of the person. The only way you live on is through your genetic code if you've been able to pass your genes on into future generations. You don't have an afterlife or a reincarnation or a resurrection. Okay, and got that? So behaviorism was a movement in psychology and philosophy that emphasized the outward behavioral aspects of thought and dismissed the inward experiential and sometimes the inner procedural aspects as well. A movement harkening back to the methodological proposals of John B. Watson, who coined the name. Watson's 1913 manifesto proposed abandoning introspectionist attempts to make consciousness a subject of experimental investigation, to focus instead on behavioral manifestations of intelligence. And so what the behaviors are looking for is more of the physical behaviors that we can actually observe, test, and study, kind of use the scientific method on, because how are you supposed to observe someone's internal state of consciousness, right? How you can't put a scope or a camera inside their head to see what they're thinking. You can only base it on their reactions and how they're acting. Okay. B.F. Skinner, he's one of our biggies, right? Later hardened behavior strictures to exclude inner psychological processing along with inward experiences as items of legitimate concern. Consequently, the successful cognitive revolution of the 1960s styled itself as a revolt against behaviorism. And I don't know that much about the cognitive revolution. Is anyone aware of that and could just give me a little synopsis of what they're talking about? Because this is definitely coming from the psychology field. Is anyone aware of that?
Did it start with Gestalt psychology because they wanted to look at the experience as the whole and not just behavior?
I hope so. I mean, because I do know a bit about Gestalt, and the time period is right, because I think that's about when Gestalt therapy started. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Gestalt therapy came out of another philosophic movement called existentialism, which focused on subjectivity and the experience of the individual. And I want to talk about Gestalt therapy next week very much. I learned about that in this class, Philosophy of Mind, and I was just fascinated by it, especially their view of mental illness and what it was. And they would have been uncomfortable even calling it mental illness. They would have simply called it someone else's internal reality. And in that sense, I mean, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but when I first started teaching for Rhombus, I asked them, what do you call the people you work with? Because in Gestalt therapy, you don't want to call them patients or mentally ill, or you don't want to put those labels on them. So I think, did Rhombus say you call them clients? Is that the term you use for the people you help with therapy?
Yes, I think patients are identified as patients within a medical facility, and a client is outside of a medical facility.
Thank you, James. And I really like that. And this idea, and we'll get into more of this next week, but the idea is that we don't use the word crazy, etc., but this idea of someone being crazy or mentally ill or not right in the head, the Gestalt therapists were saying that's a subjective cultural point of view. And in some cases, it's the person society thinks is mentally ill that could be the healthiest person in that culture, especially if you're living in a sick society, right? And so I think that's super interesting. And so what these Gestalt therapists aren't, they're not saying, okay, you have to conform to this mold of what society says to be a healthy person. They're simply trying to explain to the person they're working with that if you don't conform to certain norms and expectations of the culture in which you live, people will think you are mentally ill or dangerous, or they're not going to want you around their children or their schools or civic activities. And they might incarcerate you or institutionalize you. And so you're not telling the person they're wrong or the voices in their head aren't real or any of that. You're simply explaining to them, if you go around talking to people that no one else can see, whether you can see them or not, society at large is going to think you have problems. And so the therapy consists in not changing the person's internal world, but giving them tools to navigate living with people that aren't like them or don't perceive the world like they do. And I just thought, holy cow, that's a very different than lobotomies and electroshock therapies and all that. Is like they're not even judging or condemning that person saying they're wrong. They're simply saying, if you want to have certain privileges or access in the culture in which you live, these are the qualifications or conditions that are expected of you. And I don't know. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? That one really resonated with me. Because I always thought a good definition of crazy would be, or mentally ill, was someone who could not or will not conform to the thoughts and norms of society. But that could be a sinner or a saint, right? That could be both ends of the spectrum. All right, back to
I don't
that.
know if this is appropriate, but I'm convinced that
Hey, Lucinda.
that we have mislabeled, especially youth.
Oh, good Lord.
Take the term oppositional defiance disorder. I mean, why do we do that to people rather than saying these are your survival mechanisms that you have developed, and how do we recognize those
Absolutely.
and bring them forward in
They
our
didn't
hearts
just
and
come out
minds?
of thin air. They
Yeah.
developed that for a reason. It would also be like Pavlov's dog and the conditioning and condition responses. And this is very much how many psychologists or psychiatrists still view their profession. It's like we're dealing with condition responses. We're not dealing with things like shame and guilt and all of that. We're dealing with physiological processes. I'll give a little mid-talk summary that I came to as a young man. If the brain is broken, treat the brain. If the mind is broken, treat the mind. Like if there's actually brain damage or some chemical imbalance, then that might be an appropriate time for certain medications or change of diet or physical activity or things that's going to actually change your blood sugar and chemistry and serotonin and dopamine levels and all of that. But I don't think it's just about the chemicals. I think we also have this non-tangible mental place that you can't fix through medication or exercise or diet. It has to be done mentally or spiritually.